The independent news website The Grey Zone recently published a report saying genocide accusations against China by the U.S. government and some Western media have based on the work of a right-wing religious extremist. The U.S. and some media have been claiming that China conducts genocide against the Uyghur population in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. But according to the Grey Zone investigation, these allegations all come from one single source, a report written by a German so-called researcher whose work is full of flagrant data abuse and outright falsehoods, quote-unquote. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi also dismissed the accusations, calling them malicious and politically driven hype, fabricated out of ignorance and prejudice. What has the Grey Zone investigation found out? Why have politicians and media been able to spread such allegations or lies on Xinjiang without fear of being held accountable? What's the potential consequence of such behavior? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. I'm pleased to be joined via Zoom from DC by Max Blumenthal, editor of The Grey Zone, also one of the two authors of the Xinjiang Report. From Shanghai, Professor Shen Yi, director of the International Institute of Cyberspace Governance Research at Fudan University. From Beijing, Professor Huo Zhengxin at China University of Political Science and Law, and Ina Tangen, a former U.S. prosecutor and now an independent commentator. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Let me go to Max first. Now, in the Grey Zone report entitled U.S. State Department Accusation of China Genocide relied on data abuse and baseless claims by far-right ideologue, you debunked the so-called genocide accusation against China by Adrian Zenz, who you call a right-wing religious extremist, saying his research reveals flagrant data abuse and outright falsehood. What prompted the Grey Zone to publish such a report at this time?
Thanks for having me on. We were prompted to publish this report because we've been poking holes consistently in the disinformation and misinformation emanating from Adrian Zenz and an echo chamber of U.S. government-sponsored talking heads that is aimed to basically prevent any diplomacy between the U.S. and China and escalate this new Cold War that's underway. And so we published this for the same reason we published articles on information warfare being conducted around issues like Syria, where the U.S. State Department wants to stimulate public support for a humanitarian intervention in Syria or Libya, for example. And we've seen the effects of those humanitarian interventionist operations, which is much worse violations of human rights than we saw before. So it's pretty obvious to us at the Grey Zone and to our broader group of contributors and to many people across the West that we are being targeted by another propaganda operation based around this model of humanitarian interventionism that focuses on Xinjiang and aims to escalate the tensions and brinksmanship with China, which will lead to humanity to a terrible place.
Well, let's focus on this latest article you published on Xinjiang. It strongly argues that Zenz's research shows that his assertion of genocide is contradicted by flagrant data abuse, fraudulent claims, cherry-picking of source material, and inventing statistics. Some pretty serious blames or big names, big words you're using here. Could you give us, for instance, one example or the biggest example of the so-called flagrant data abuse there? How do you make that conclusion?
We went in detail in forensic fashion and picked apart his most consequential paper on supposed forced sterilizations in Xinjiang, which Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State, cited in order to build the case that China was committing genocide. He cited Zenz by name and this paper. This paper was quoted in the AP, CNN, and many other publications, and it was clear that they didn't fact-check Zenz. This paper was not published in an academic publication. There was no peer review. It was published by the Jamestown Foundation, which was created under the watch of the former CIA director, Bill Casey, in order to find a pass-through for paying Soviet dissidents. So it was essentially created as a CIA front. And it would have never passed muster at any academic publication for the following reason. One of Zentz's major findings was that 80% of all new net IUD insertions of birth control devices, took place in Xinjiang in 2018. Now that sounds like 80% of all IUD insertions in China took place in this one province, Xinjiang. That's how any reader would interpret it. We went to Adrian Zentz's source, the 2019 China Statistical Yearbook, and found that only 8.7% of IUD insertions took place in Xinjiang. But he uses manipulative language about new net insertions so that he can come back and say, well, what I did was I added up all of the insertions of IUDs and subtracted the removals from every province in China, came up with this number of something like 380,000. Xinjiang's total was 239,000 total net insertions, and that is 80% of the net total. But then if you look deeper into it, you find that Henan province, for example, had 206,000 net insertions, which totals 69% of the total net insertions. So that means that one province has 80% of the total and the other has 69%, which is more than 100%. It doesn't make sense. So even the tricky manipulation that Zentz used to try to justify this incendiary statistic of 80% doesn't make sense. But you can see what he's doing. He's manipulating statistics to make it seem like women in Xinjiang are being coerced and even forced in birth control surgeries, to the point where a majority of them are forced to do so. It's completely bogus. Even worse, there's a graph in Adrian Zentz's paper where he claims that women in Xinjiang receive between 800 and 1,400 net added IUD placements per capita. What does that mean? Per capita, per person. That means that according to Adrian Zentz, women receive 4 to 8 IUD placement surgeries per day in Xinjiang. Wow. How can any woman receive that many birth control surgeries in a day? It makes no sense. And you just follow any footnote, any claim he makes, search the citation, and you'll see what a manipulator and propagandist he is. And it's unfortunate that none of the media organizations or the US government or even his own fact checkers managed to check this, and it was left up to us.
It's really quite unbelievable to hear how, how different what his conclusion may sound from what actually may have happened, and yet that all of this goes kind of unnoticed, unchecked by whoever decided to use his data. Another thing that we noticed, for instance, his use of picture. You also talked about that. Use of photo. You also talked about that in your report. For instance, this photo, this particular one we're going to show, is interpreted by Zentz as an effort to enforce the thorough implementation of increasingly intrusive birth control measures. However, if you take a look at the photo, the people centered in the photo are actually very elderly, don't look like people who are in, active reproductive age. And it turns out that this photo was taken from a Chinese news website about poverty eradication program in this place in Xinjiang, where the local people were given free physical checks and consultations. So what does this say about his research? Could it have made a mistake, let's say because he doesn't know the Chinese language, or he never been to Xinjiang? Could it have been a mistake?
Well, it's remarkable that this incendiary and very consequential claim of genocide is based on research that is not carried out in an academic setting, not published in an academic journal, not authored by someone who has ever been to the region he claims expertise in, and who is not even a China scholar with any record of China scholarship. And it's unclear if they even speak Chinese. This photo that you mentioned not only shows an elderly couple being visited by a free medical clinic and receiving free medical care that I think many of my neighbors in the United States would yearn for. They're surrounded by elderly people. I don't see anyone in the photo who is of childbearing age. And Zentz cites this photo as an example of coercive birth control measures and mass surveillance, which really goes to his own prejudice. It appears that he sees any effort at free healthcare and government outreach and government poverty alleviation as evil, along with birth control. And we can get into his own personal ideology, but throughout his paper, Adrian Zentz conflates free public healthcare investments, including the $5 billion that was invested in Xinjiang in 2017, with a policy of genocide. And he omits in articles he cites discussions and statistics about the reduction of maternal and infant mortality rates. Now, if China wanted to commit genocide against the Uyghur population of Xinjiang, then why is it taking these efforts, which have been documented by medical publications like Lancet, to reduce the death rate of mothers and infants at birth? That doesn't really add up or make sense, but Zentz leaves this out of his analysis conveniently.
Yeah. Well, some people would really say, if his research is so shoddy, why he's interviewed on national television in Western countries by the German national television. He's quoted by the BBC. He's used by CNN. He's used by U.S. former high government, officials, and now the Secretary of State also endorses this kind of genocide theory. How is that possible?
It really is a commentary on the sad state of U.S. media and an entire corporate and mainstream media that marches in lockstep. It is very much like a regime media. When someone like Adrian Zentz is put forward by a public relations firm or one of these think tanks in Washington, those who interview him don't question his background. And so it's been left up to us to do that questioning, to look into his background and his lack of academic credentials and the data manipulation that he employs to advance a biased claim, which and arrive at a conclusion which the U.S. government or hardline elements within it are seeking in order to block diplomacy with China. So he plays a very convenient and important role for a part of the political establishment that seeks escalation with China, and that's why he's been given a free pass. And I can tell you, within the academic world, there's a lot of pressure and censorship and self-censorship. If you speak out about this, you will pay a price. If you speak out about this in media, you'll pay a price. Adrian Zentz personally threatened to sue, to take to court, one of the leading Syria scholars in the United States, Joshua Landis, because he tweeted our article out. He promoted the article on Twitter, and Landis's tweet was erased soon after. I don't know if there was a pressure campaign or not, but it's pretty obvious that people get in hot water for questioning Zentz.
Are you not afraid? Are you not worried or concerned that you might get into order for exposing all of this? Have you received any threats or letters or pressure from anywhere not to do these?
Well, at the Gray Zone, we receive a lot of pressure and threats, legal threats to shut us down. Article I just published about Western media acting as intelligence contractors based on leaked documents was just given its own unique Twitter label by Twitter, claiming that the article may have relied on hacked materials. So there's an obvious campaign to suppress us, but the main consequence that I personally face and that we face at the Gray Zone for questioning this narrative is that we get labeled deniers of genocide, essentially Holocaust deniers, when what we're actually doing is scrutinizing and applying skepticism, rational skepticism, to State Department propaganda, the propaganda our own government is using to drive hostility internationally. And this is a lesson that I learned when I was first entering journalism, and the whole media following the narrative of the Bush State Department, including Congress, on Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. I see the same techniques being applied here to manipulate the media, Congress, and the public, and it's working. So I think it's our job to actually provide some rational skepticism.
What otherwise do you see as potential consequence if this kind of practice, this kind of operations, somebody commissioned a research that's funded by a certain political force, which comes up with a flagrant accusation that's baseless, but this accusation is treated as fact and quoted and used as reference to support some kind of policy. What do you think is the consequence, a potential consequence of such an operation?
I should mention that this campaign actually began in the 1990s when Congress began hosting Uyghur exiles through the International Relations Committee under the watch of pro-regime change figures like Representative Tom Lantos. And they were putting forward very similar testimonies about, forced abortions and so on. And they were trying at the time to prevent Bill Clinton and the Clinton administration from giving China most favored nation trading status. They failed in that round. But now that hostility is intensified, they're succeeding, and the lower house in Canada's parliament has just voted unanimously to accuse China of genocide. Who testified in those hearings? Almost all of the people brought to testify were Uyghur exiles sponsored by the US government and cultivated by the US government, and none other than Adrian Zenz, whose background as a far-right extremist and a data manipulator guilty of statistical fraud never came into the picture. So this is what's happening across the West, and Canada is going to use that to put pressure on the Biden administration and thereby put pressure on the rest of the West to boycott the Olympics in Beijing.
Well, that's a very dangerous practice because eventually, like the trade war we have seen, that the U.S. launched on China, a bad policy based on bad information eventually hurts oneself, right? As we have seen from the trade war that was launched a couple of years ago. But many thanks, Max. As it's too late in your side of the world, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for these insights, and keep up your hard work. Now let me get back
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks. Let me have the other guests back here, Professor Sheng Yi, Professor Huo, and Einar Tangen. So I want to get your takes of this report that's recently published by the Gray Zone and the findings of this report. Actually, it's not surprised at all because when Adrian Zenz gave out his work last year, in the middle of last year, we, on The Point, and especially in my mini segment, Headline Buster, we already debunked many of the statistics and some of what this report found actually were already debunked by the Chinese media as well, ever since that the so-called report was put out by Adrian Zenz, and yet it seems that the truth has not managed to get out there, right? And from what we have seen, what we have heard from Max, there is really a complete blindness of choice from many Western politicians and Western media not to try to look into the truth behind the veil. Professor Shen, what is your comments?
I think it's a kind of politics. It's quite clear those guys, they don't just care what really what the truth is. They need to spread some disinformation. They need to use this information as kind of tools to launch a kind of strategic campaign or to take advantages of China on strategic issues. But the real challenge is it will be difficult to find the real evidence. I think it's very interesting development of the signals represent those highly concerned from certain peoples in these countries who cannot afford the possible so-called cost to admit or to recognize the proper development or the improvement from China's side in any aspect.
Professor Huo, what is your take? I know you have joined our program where we've discussed this time and again, and now Gray Zone also published this report, of course, in a more comprehensive manner. How do you look at the huge gap between what is described of Xinjiang in terms of population on this particular subject and what actually is happening on the ground?
What actually happened in Xinjiang is very different from the report by these Western media. In my opinion, is that sometimes I'm also a little bit confused by these Western media. On the one hand, impartiality and neutrality are the image or the reputation that they try to build and cherish. However, on the other hand, they are trying to destroy this reputation or image when they report on China, especially like the situation in Xinjiang or the report in Hong Kong, for example, when the riots in Hong Kong broke into the Legislative Council, Western media described that these riots are defending democracy and rule of law. However, when the Western media reporting the riots broke into the Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., they are concluding that the American democracy and rule of law is on the threat. So I think that the double standard used by the Western media is a big problem for the Western world. They are destroying reputation that they used to cherish.
Aina, your take on the situation, having heard, I mean, you have been following this topic all along, and sometimes indeed there is a feeling of helplessness because when you have so many lies being spread on a much more efficient machine, then truth can get out. And it takes time, right, to debunk a lie. You have to be there, you have to show the proof, you have to think about how to really make it easy to understand. For instance, when it involves a lot of numbers, you know, some people just switch off and say, oh, I don't understand what you're talking about, can't follow it, so I don't know. So how do you, I just feel helpless, you know, sometimes it's like, what are we going to do if you refuse to hear?
Well, I think what you're suffering for is what I would call the Trump effect. Rather than telling a few lies, which could be examined, you tell so many that no one can keep up. And you know what you have here is just a classic disinformation campaign. Adrian Zenz is part of it. He's paid by the Jamestown Foundation, which, as Max said, is associated with the CIA. It was founded by Casey, who was a former CIA director. The other part is the CRHD, the China Human Rights Defender Group, which is funded by the NEA, National Endowment for Democracy. NED, that National Endowment for Democracy, and they are also part and parcel of the same entity, the CIA. They were created after Reagan was caught with the Iran Contra arms for oil scandal, I should say. And in what it is these are groups who are set out by the CIA to create disinformation bases. They frown on anybody exposing them, as you can heard from Max. And this is not about hypocrisy or anything like that. This is a long-standing procedure within the United States to, in essence, back up whatever claims that we want, whether it's weapons of mass destruction or against any regime that we feel that we do not want. So, this is just, as I said, classic disinformation. It shouldn't be given too much notice, except for the fact that it's being swallowed whole by the international community, apparently.
What do you think, and this question to the three of you, what do you think is the potential consequence of that? Because I see it as a very problematic thing. As I said to Max, having looked at what came out of the trade war, it turned out, numerous research from the U.S. business community, from the researchers community, they have all pointed to much greater gain than much greater losses than gains on the U.S. part from the trade war. So, who's going to gain from a wrong policy, from confrontation that's flared up based on lies and fabrication? Professor Shen. Because the U.S. did the U.S. benefit from the Iraq War, for instance?
That's a very good question. It depends on the actors and the different lengths of the time you estimate who got benefits from such kind of lies. To those people who produce these lies, they believe they can take advantage of such kind of lies to launch a kind of offensive propaganda toward China. And such kind of propaganda they believe can do damage to China's reputations and raise concern and slow down the development of China's development, and to providing legitimacy basement to supporting their stupid short-term policies to deal with Sino-US relationships. But in the long term, finally, I think the United States will be the big loser of the whole games. But on the other side, we need to find different tactics to countering back such kind of stupid lies in the short terms, mainly based on our fact-check capacities, like the Gray Zone did. They during this report do nothing more than to check the facts. I think there will be enough rational readers from your side believe, at least, even though they maybe still believe we have a competition between our two countries, they should use a more smarter and proper report based on the truth.
The reality that we're living in today is that if you say, I'm just reporting that someone is saying this, then I don't have a responsibility to say, to check whether what this person said is truthful or not, because I simply said that someone said this. But actually, by doing this, by thinking it is okay to do this, they've actually contributed to spread lies. At least there is this possibility. And in this case, if the report is so shoddy, then they have to highlight well up in the front and say this unverifiable claim of genocide is endorsed by the US Secretary of State, for instance. Then people are adequately warned. And yet no paper has done that kind of thing, at least not what I have seen. Einar.
Well, no, and I wouldn't have any hope that they will. But, I think at this point, it's best for China to just take reports like Adrian Zenz is putting out and put them under the microscope, invite other scholars to do the same thing, send their findings out to publications, refute him in valid international peer-reviewed papers and journals. It's really the only way that you can combat kind of nonsense that's going on. And as far as who is benefiting, no one is benefiting.
I think eventually, instead of nobody being able to gain from such operation, I think the ones who are propagating this kind of lies are going to suffer the most. History will tell us. Anyway, Very annoying topic, but we have to do this discussion. Professor Shen Yi joining us from Fudan University in Shanghai, Professor Huo joining us from here in Beijing, and Ina Tangen also joining us here in Beijing. Many thanks for these gentlemen for joining us, and that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. Go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.